Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the final update to the United Conservative Party leadership race 2022. So, I will just start this off. You might see that this looks wild. Jean's wiped out. Taze has been taken over downtown Edmonton. What is going on? Okay, well, I will have to confess, I found a big bug. This was quite a big bug. I won't really go into the details. But long story short, I was doing an adjustment wrong. This is something I had previously fixed for the federal model, which was debuted in the federal model update. Not sure if I even mentioned it because it wasn't that important. For what? Anyways, doesn't matter. I forgot to update in this one. So the last update for this did not have that fix, so I had a big bug. Fixing that bug, Jean drops significantly, and Taze gains some ground, as does Smith, and some the other people gain some stuff elsewhere. So, this is much more accurate. And if you recall my conversation on those previous videos, I was a bit confused why Jean was doing so well. This makes much more sense because his campaign doesn't seem focused or very clear at all, and I don't really know how he was supposed to be winning. Or close to winning. Not close to not winning, that's the wrong word. Competitive. Now we have very clear, it's Taze versus Smith, and with the most recent Angus Reid poll providing much needed data to help make the riding level forecasts better, this map is possibly accurate. It's still a much higher error bar than I would put on, for example, my last Canadian federal election forecast, but it is significantly lower error than it was last week, because this poll brought in more detail for education, income, previous voting history, stuff like that. And again, previous voting history isn't used because I'm assuming NDPers are going to vote in this area, but it tends to be the case that areas where, say, the NDP will be really strong tend to be less hardcore right-wing. So those areas will likely be support more moderate candidates. Not exhaustively true, but likely. And I have a bunch of other corrections in place to account for the fact that we're only looking at the UCP members and not the general population, but it is useful to gauge where baseline support is, otherwise this would look very uniform. So as a result, we get what seems to be more accurate number or riding coloring. For example, Smith is the strongest in southern rural Alberta, particularly, and she gets the weakest in cities. Red Deer is weaker than the area around it. Lethbridge is weaker than the area around it. Grand Prairie is weaker than the area around it. I can't think of the name of this guy, but it's also weaker than the area around it. Calgary is a minor exception. She is stronger in Calgary than she is in the areas just around Calgary, but in Calgary itself, the more suburby you get, or the more outskirtsy you get, I guess is more accurate, the stronger she gets. In Edmonton, same thing. More outskirtsy you get, more stronger Smith is, and the closer you get to the middle of Edmonton, the stronger Taze is. Though I will note, not that Taze is winning, which you'll see in a minute, this would be a bad result for Taze, because if he's the most popular in areas that the UCP will probably never win, that's not a very good showing. So, this is the first round, obviously. We have Smith at 36.7, Taze at 27.8, and Jean at 20.7. I don't have maps generated for other ones because, as you will see in a second, really not much will change, and at the end it will probably just all be the darkest color for Smith. I didn't generate the map, but it likely would be. because if we pop over here and we see the results. So just before I start going into the results of the numbers here, let's just do some touch base to figure out what is what. So this other column, it includes Sani because I haven't decided to break out Sani per se in the model. And in earliest polls, there were other candidates that were possibly throwing their hats in or were speculated. And this captures all of them. Most of those candidates are not running. Only Sani is, as far as I'm aware. So, for various reasons, I'm moving this one first, but I don't, as an executive decision of the one making this model, I don't think it is accurate to remove them from the polling because that is other support. It is not support per se for any of these 6, or I guess Sani herself, but I did not include Sani because she's polling really bad. So we drop other first, even though technically speaking, in a ranked choice vote, she would not be dropped or this column would not be dropped first because it's bigger than Lahir's column. But for technical reasons, this is actually like representing hypothetically like 5 or 6 people, even though only one of them is actually still in the race. If that makes sense. So so what we get here is when the other drops, you drop Sani and the rest of them first, and then you get a slight change for everyone else. Her support mainly seems to go to Ahir and a little bit to Taze and Jean, but not massively so. Not in a manner that's particularly significant. And I will also note here, remaining turnout is showing what percentage of ballots are left being counted. In other words, 100 minus this is the exhausted ballots. So obviously, round 1, you have all the ballots. And then by round 6 here, 10% of the ballots will be exhausted. So at the end of round 2, Ahir is the lowest, so she has dropped, and her votes are redistributed, and they, again, don't really concentrate anywhere in particular. Scholes gets a decent bump, and so does Jean, but not in a manner that's actually significant or meaningful. Then, at the end of round 3, Lewin is the lowest, so Lewin is dropped, and we get this. Here, again, we kind of start seeing the same shtick. Scholes gets a little bit, but not that significant. Jean and Taze actually get a decent bump, but again, not meaningful enough to change the race. And Smith actually starts getting doesn't change the race, but gets a disproportionate number of the second choice votes, so she actually starts increasing her relative lead. Not that it actually matters, because again, at no point so far has the second choice votes been concentrated enough to matter. Round 5, Scholes drops, and this is the only time where it gets a little interesting. It's just Scholes doesn't have enough support for it to be particularly interesting. So her second choice mostly goes to Jean and Taze, and only a very small amount to Smith, about 0.8. And a decent amount to stop voting at this point. Their ballots are exhausted. Unfortunately, for Taze, or Jean, it is not enough to actually change the math, because as soon as you get at the end of round 5, Jean is the smallest, Jean drops, and Jean's voters are likely to break overwhelmingly for Smith, and that takes Smith from a narrow victory to a large victory, though even then, 58.3 to about 41.7 is not an overwhelming victory. We're not looking at a Poilievre level win here with 68% of points, 71% of votes. But it is likely to be a solid, decisive victory, which shouldn't surprise anybody because by polling, her main thing, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, is very popular among the UCP. And in a election like this, in a race like this, having a big piece of legislative agenda that is quite popular among your own party, who are the only people voting, are going to help put you over the end. Because if we look at the polling on this, UCP voters, this is going to be interesting, 57% of them support the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and only 30% oppose it, with 14 don't know, can't say. This is shockingly close to these numbers. I don't think that is a what's the word for it? I don't think that is a coincidence. I think that is a large part of what's driving this. And in my experience, and from what I can tell, I think this might be possibly the only reason Smith is going to win. I think if she didn't propose the Alberta Sovereignty Act, I think Taze might have actually narrowly won. But narrowly won in a very weak way, kind of like Scheer did in 2017, where he only won by a few, I think it was 1% on the final ballot. Here, Smith is winning by a slightly more decisive 16%, but still, that's not that decisive. Now, the question you might be springing to your mind from this, if she might be getting pushed over the line because of the Alberta Sovereignty Act, will that be hurting her in the general? And I think, largely speaking, no. Because there's two things to consider. Yes, 30% of the UCP voters oppose it, and 14% are indifferent. So you could look at it in one way and say only 71% would be open to voting for, because 30%, there's some rounding here, but 30% oppose the act. But that's not exactly accurate, because, well, first, this is a big one, 90%, sorry, is it 90%? Do these numbers matter? Yes, sorry. 90%, just about, of UCP members think Notley winning would be bad or terrible. So in Alberta, where it's effectively a very strong two-party system with Wild Rose Party and the Alberta Party having both low vote share and almost no chance of seats, and the Liberal Party being effectively dead, I think my model has them at a half percentage point of popular vote right now, it's very likely that even if the UCP members don't like Smith or the Act, or voters I should say, they're still going to vote for her because of lesser of two evils thing. Now you might argue that's not good for democracy or some etc., etc. But the thing is, electorally speaking, that's not that big of a problem. So I don't think it's going to actually meaningfully impact her. And the other thing is, you might see polling in general saying 53% of people in Alberta oppose the Alberta Sovereignty Act, but, well, that's mostly overwhelmingly driven by NDP voters. So NDP voters opposing legislation by Conservative is not that shocking and not that meaningful. If they supported it, that would be more interesting. If they oppose it, that doesn't really tell you anything. Just like Conservatives in general in Canada oppose Trudeau's gun ban. That doesn't, strictly speaking, tell you anything about the political effectiveness of the gun ban. Because this is the important thing when you're talking about opinion polling and this kind of thing. People, I think, intentionally misinterpret this to mean something it doesn't. Someone supporting something doesn't mean it's good or bad. The layperson's opinion on legislation or good governance is very rarely based on objective facts and most often based off ideological priors. And possibly, for some voters, based off of just partisanship. So if you take a poll for a conservative or a thing a conservative did, and the not conservatives really don't like it, that doesn't actually tell you anything if it's a good or bad policy, but it can tell you if it's good or bad electorally, based on other things. Trudeau's gun ban is potentially good for him electorally because the people who will vote for him like it, or at least are sympathetic to it. And people who will never vote for him, hardcore conservatives, hate it, but that doesn't really matter to him. Now, you do have to be a little concerned because you might increase their turnout, but in general terms, turnout being equal, it doesn't actually hurt you that meaningfully. So in the case of the Alberta Sovereignty Act, yeah, about 93-94% of the NDP probably don't want it or hate it. But that probably doesn't matter because the NDP is a pretty weak party in Alberta. We're talking about 30 to 40% being their range. Their best election result, I think, was 41. So it's very unlikely that they actually would be able to cross the line because of this act. Maybe their voters will turn out more, but generally speaking, the NDP vote is, first off, extremely inefficient in Alberta, and second, it's low to begin with. So if it's low and it turns out more in an inefficient way, it's very unlikely to change anything. But on the flip side, from pure electoral math standpoint, and this is where something controversial like, again, the gun bans or, again, the Sovereignty Act might actually be beneficial, is people typically are more likely to vote affirmatively and are more likely to vote for ideas. So, again, we'll use the gun ban as an example. The gun ban is a big idea. The problem? Increasing violent crime. How do we solve it? Liberal idea. We ban guns. That is a big idea. It's a dumb idea, but that doesn't particularly matter. Because liberal sympathetic voters who are concerned about crime see this idea being pushed, they see that there's something being done, and it makes them more excited to vote for the party. Our guys are fixing the problem. Or, look, this is a big deal. I really want this because I think it's going to work, because their ideological priors, private civilian firearm ownership is dangerous, are being confirmed. So they're more likely to come out and vote for something like this. That's why it makes good policy. Makes good electoral sense, while being bad policy. The Alberta Sovereignty Act, I won't necessarily say if it's good or bad policy yet, because I'm not entirely sure what it would actually mean in practice. There's been a lot of criticism on it and some ideas. It's not a wildly unheard of concept. I mean, lots of US states have effectively introduced sanctuary laws, and if it's used in the way I think it's going to be used, where provincial resources and policing aren't going to be used to enforce federal laws, then in a lot of sense, it'll probably be kind of a wash in actual policy impact. But that's future discussion as if it's more fleshed out or once it's been implemented. But on electoral math, what this means is, yes, some NDP voters might be more willing to turn out because they oppose it, but again, people rarely turn out because they oppose something. If that was the case, the US voting turnout would be close to 100%, because you've talked to Americans, they all hate one politician. It's just, if you either Democrat or the Republican candidate, they very dislike one of the two of them. The problem is, in the US, oftentimes people don't actually like the other guy. So you might think the Republican or the Democrat sucks, but you don't actually think the other guy's better. So you don't bother voting, because why do you care? If both suck, why does it matter? So the negative thing, yes, you might think it will be more specific, Democrat is worse, but you think Republicans are still bad, you don't really care. In the case of the NDP, if you don't like the Conservatives and the Conservatives do something you don't like, that's probably not going to make you vote and more likely to vote anyways. Unfortunately, we don't have polling by other affiliations or just other voters, so we don't know how it would affect them, but in the case of Alberta, it really doesn't matter because UCP vote in 2019 and historically is an absolute majority of the province, so it's not particularly matter. Doesn't particularly matter. So in the case of UCP voters, the two things you have to make sure, in the case of Smith, and why I think the Sovereignty Act makes a lot of electoral sense, and why it's good election policy, is some UCP member voters really like it. They really like the idea because they are sick and tired of the feds creeping on provincial jurisdiction, doing federal laws that they think are hurting their province out of spite, and are doing things that they don't agree with and they don't think are priorities. Gun ban, carbon tax, to name two. Pipeline ban, or restrictions as well, to name a third. So, there is a lot of reason there why UCP voters would be excited to see a politician proposing something that looks concrete to at least start tackling the problem. The Sovereignty Act might not fix the problem of the feds trampling Alberta's jurisdiction and causing harm to the province by damaging its main industries or raising taxes effectively semi-selectively. Yes, it does affect other provinces, but it also doesn't affect others like Quebec or my home province of Nova Scotia, where we technically pay lower carbon taxes, though come April, it looks like Nova Scotia is also going to be hit by the carbon tax. So there's that. But the key here is it does look like it is attempting to do something. Kenny made a big talk and big noise about opposing the feds, and up until recently, with saying Alberta is going to withhold provincial policing resources from confiscating firearms, he hadn't really done anything concrete. Now, that's not to say Kenny hadn't done anything in reality, but nothing that the average lay voter is going to see and going to be able to point to. You can argue joining lawsuits about the carbon tax and stuff like that, or maybe actions he did, but they ultimately failed, so that doesn't really engender confidence among lay voters. So, in that regard, the Sovereignty Act is a big, bold idea that is a concrete proposal to do something on something that a lot of these people care about. And when you're thinking about going to the polls, it is often easier to motivate yourself to go vote, because voting is a hassle, and it should be a hassle. Not like an extreme hassle, but I think you should have to go fill out a paper ballot at a polling precinct. But that's another topic. To get yourself motivated over the edge to actually go out and vote, you typically are only motivated by one of three things. Pure and utter partisanship, which the Sovereignty Act's not going to affect, because if someone's a UCP partisan, they're a UCP partisan. They're not going to suddenly become an NDP partisan. That doesn't work. It doesn't happen. Not over one election. So those guys you don't care about. Then you have the anti-NDP voters, and the anti-NDP voters are probably going to vote for you either way because they're anti-NDP voters. They're voting for you to stop the NDP, so as long as you are the most likely to stop the NDP, they're going to continue to vote for you. I personally think anti-voting is not the best plan in the world, just as a strategic standpoint, but that's a whole other topic. But again, the anti-voters, they're probably not going to be affected by this because they're not voting for the UCP affirmatively, they're voting against the NDP. That's the point. Then you have conservatives, i.e. the base. These are people who support the UCP because the UCP says things they like. Unlike the partisans and unlike the anti-voters who are voting for the UCP out of just partisanship or because they hate the other guy, the base will vote for the UCP because the UCP says things the base likes. And that is the group the Sovereignty Act really targets. You win elections by getting the base to go vote, particularly in Canada, where we typically have turnout somewhere between 50 and 70%. Getting the base to vote is a very big part of the game. As already established, a large portion of the voters for the UCP aren't going to be affected by this. But the core base who voluntarily vote for the UCP likely are the ones that this is targeted to, and are likely people who support this kind of thing because the ideologically conservative group of Alberta are sick and tired of the feds crushing Alberta. You can argue to the degree that that is perceived versus real, but the perception by them is that the feds are crushing Alberta either out of spite or out of negligence. Neither is good. And this is something, the Sovereignty Act, that actually might solve that. So, just to wrap this up, no, the Sovereignty Act isn't going to make Smith lose a leadership race. And no, it likely won't negatively impact her in the general, and it might positively impact her in the general. I will get more into this when I eventually do a Alberta general update, maybe a week or two, we'll see. I'm going to see if I can get another poll before I do anything, but if not, I will do one before the end of the month. But Alberta is very much, for the Conservative faction, a province where turnout matters more than attracting swing voters. The Conservatives have an overwhelming advantage in Alberta when it comes to ideological conservatives. Alberta has more people who will vote conservative than any other province. That's not really exciting or saying anything. So the goal for someone like the leader of the UCP should be a way to get out the vote. It not necessarily should be about reaching across the aisle to steal NDP voters. It shouldn't be about getting voters from the Alberta Party, the Wild Rose Party. If you get that, that's great, but your primary concern should be to get your base to vote when it comes to an election. Now, you have other concerns on how to govern and how to actually be a good leader, but election math has almost nothing to do with actually governing, or else every government would always be good. In fact check false, most governments aren't very good. At best, they're kind of meh. But the thing is, if you, as a candidate, or you as a voter, believe that your party, this leader, would be good, you have to understand electoral math to win. It's like how people with rhetoric can mislead you into the wrong ideas, or people can lie with statistics and convince you of false data. But you need data, and you need rhetoric to actually make a good argument. Electoral considerations and electoral math can make you win while being a soulless suit that doesn't do anything, but it won't make you win for long. But if you are someone who isn't a soulless suit and actually is motivated by doing the best for your voters, and possibly the entire jurisdiction you're governing, you then need to consider electoral math to get there. So it is something that you do need to consider, but in and of itself is not, strictly speaking, good or bad, if that makes sense. So Smith running a very smart campaign electorally doesn't intrinsically mean she's going to govern well or govern bad. But it does mean is that either herself or her campaign advisors are some smart cookies when it comes to actually getting elected. And with that, I will bid you adieu, and we will see on Thursday how close I am. I am undecided as of yet if I will do a live stream for the results. I'm not entirely sure when it would be out. I don't, for work related, or for work schedule, I don't have no work Friday, so I technically could do it. Depends on a couple things. You will find out Thursday at noon Eastern time when I release my Thursday video. I will front load it in the video there if I'm doing a stream that night. But for now, I'm undecided. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you Thursday with something American.